Hello and welcome back to this video tutorial from BlenderCookie.com on creating the axe. In part 2 of this short tutorial series, we're going to be looking at texturing the model that we created in the previous tutorial. And some of the things that I'm going to be showing you in this tutorial are, number one, how to prepare the model for texturing, which includes any kind of model tweaks that we need to do, creating seams, unwrapping the UVs, and exporting the UV layout. Then we're going to take those UVs into Photoshop, do some texturing via image-based texturing, and then we'll continue on doing some things like ambient occlusion baking to add more info into the texture, and then how to convert those textures into a bump map, and finally render the entire thing. So at least that's the goal for this tutorial, and we'll see where we go. So starting out, there's a couple of things that we need to do on the model. So let's just go ahead and select the model, and the first thing I want to do is go ahead and merge all of these into one single piece. But if you remember, some of these are using modifiers. So first let's select the axe head and go over to the modifiers panel, and you'll notice that it has a mirror and subsurf modifier. And the subsurf is fine, we can leave that as is, but we need to go ahead and apply the mirror modifier. So we can just click apply, and now you'll notice that we have one solid model. Okay, perfect. Next, let's go ahead and select the handle, and I'm going to go ahead and turn on optimal display just so it cleans up my view a little bit. And it's got just subsurf on, so that's fine. And then on the straps, we notice we've got just subsurf and just subsurf. Now, this is actually a mistake on my part because at the end of the previous tutorial, each of these straps actually had both a Shrinkwrap and a Solidify modifier on. And right after finishing the tutorial, I actually applied each of those modifiers and then saved the model and forgot to revert back to it before recording this one. But no worries, if you are still using the previous model, all you need to do on these straps is first apply the Shrinkwrap modifier and then apply the Solidify modifier in that order in order to keep things accurate. And then at this point we can go ahead and just select everything, and let's make the handle our primary selection since I like the origin point on this, and just hit Ctrl J and it will merge it into one single model. So at this point, if we go into edit mode, we can see that we have several things. One, you'll notice something that's a little bit odd are that on the straps, or the lacing, we have these interesting lines and that appear to be seams, when in fact actually it is an indication of the creasing that was applied from the Solidify modifier. So just ignore them for the time being. They don't actually mean anything. Well, they don't mean anything in regards to what we're doing right now. So what I want to do now is first let's take a look at the model, because I know that there's a couple of things that aren't quite right. For example, let's look at, if you zoom in here, and we've got these kind of like these metal pieces that are surrounding the wood, and you'll notice that we have a slight bevel here. And this isn't right, because if this is just a metal ring wrapped around the wood, then that's not going to be quite right. So I'm just going to scale that in. And just to save time, I'm just going to go ahead and do that in several different places, just real quick, just selecting the loop, and then scale it in. And this is actually just a mistake that I made during modeling while I wasn't thinking about the fact that I was going to need to scale those in while texturing. So that was my mistake, but we can fix that just real quick here. So there we go. And then one other thing that I thought of, and you may think that I'm just being lazy on this, but let me go ahead and first show you what I'm going to do and then tell you why. And I'm going to add a little bit more to the model here on the top, and that is to add a end cap to this, which we can do simply by adding in a loop cut, Control R, scale it up, and then maybe, actually we'll take it all the way up and scale it in, add in another loop right here to sharpen that up, and then another loop here. So now this could be a metal end cap on this. Maybe we'll move all of these down a little. Now, you may think that I'm just being lazy, which in some parts I am, because I don't really want to texture the end cap on the wood, because that can really be a pain. It provides a lot of areas where we've got to work with seams, and in the scope of this tutorial, I don't really have the time to try and deal with all those seams and such without taking a large amount of time. But what it's also showing is a little trick that you can use to make the texturing process for you easier. Most people that I know dread texturing. You know, there are those that enjoy it. It's kind of one of those things like rigging. You either love it or you hate it. Personally, I hate it. While I love the result, I loathe the process. And so anytime I can find a little thing that will not only help me speed up the texturing process or remove a mundane part of it, such as texturing the end caps, and can lend to the overall result, such as add a little more style, it brings a little more cohesion between the end of the handle and the end here, I'm going to go for it. So in this case, while it may, in a sense, it's making me lazy, but then at the time, it's also making me efficient. And personally, I kind of like to think of it as making me efficient, so we're going to leave it at that. Okay, so now we're ready to go ahead and add all the seams to our model so that we can unwrap this. If you're not familiar with UV unwrapping or anything like that, I encourage you to check out my tutorial on unwrapping a human head on Blender Cookie. It goes into a little more detail on the UVs. Since we're going to be covering a lot of other things in this tutorial, I'm not going to go into great detail about them. The gist of it is that we can apply seams to our model that then tell the model how to unwrap the UVs onto a 2D plane. So we're going to go in and we're just going to select it via edge loops. So let's first select this loop here, and we're selecting them right at the seam between the wood and the metal, and then we can just hit Control E and mark seam. So I'm going to mark a seam between each of the wood and metal pieces. Just here, 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 and here. And it's just Control E, mark seam. Okay, so that separates most of those out. And let's go ahead and I'm just going to split my view like this. And I'm going to switch this view over to the UV image editor. And now I have just a default one in here that's saved from my default setup. And let's just close that. And now you'll see that we have just all of our UVs as just a single face. But if in the 3D view we hit U and unwrap, you'll start to see all of the pieces. And currently it still looks like crap because all we've told it to do is separate out these objects here, which is if we switch into face mode and hit L, we can separate or we can select them based on the seams. And you'll see it's just circles. Well, this is because we haven't given it a way to unwrap like a roll of cloth. We haven't allowed it to unroll itself. It's only able to separate out the selection. So there's no seam on them in which it can split. And so what I'm going to do here is just Alt-right click, select this entire loop, and then from the front view, let's go in, hit C to bring up our circle select, and using the middle mouse button to deselect, I want to deselect everything but the loop along the front edge. And we can zoom in to make sure that we're going all the way up to the point. Deselect that one with B and middle click, or middle click and drag. And up here, do the same thing all the way up to there. So now we hit Control E and mark seam, save my file, select everything, and U unwrap again. And now you can see the things are starting to work out. So now we've got our handles, which if we go into face mode again, we can see them separately. And so you can see that that is starting to work. But now we still have a few issues in that the head is still one solid thing, the lacings are one solid, and then this one doesn't quite work. Well, okay, so let's go ahead and keep going. And on the head here, the way I'm going to unwrap this is I'm going to add a seam right down the center here, although I just want it along the blade of the axe, so I can deselect, I'll deselect these areas again by C and then middle click and dragging just to paint across those vertices that I don't want selected. So I just want the edge. Control E, mark seam, and then I'm going to select these edges here and here, all these perimeter edges. There we go. And now I need to zoom in, and you can see it missed a couple of vertices where the edge loops were not continuous. So I will add those to the selection. Just shift right click. There we are. And now I can go ahead and hit Control E, mark seam. Let's select everything again, and U and unwrap. Okay, it's getting better. You can see the head of the axe here, the edges, but we're still not quite there. There's still a couple areas that aren't working. So if we go back into face mode, we can start selecting the things and see what's going on. See what we've missed so far. Everything's looking good, looking good. And there we go. We can see that we're still missing the laces. So if we go back to vertex mode or edge mode, and let's just go in here. Oh, and one thing that you'll notice is that we forgot something else. All of these lacings have interior faces here, as you can see like this. We don't want those because we're not going to texture them. It's not going to do anything but cause us trouble because you're never going to see them. So let's go ahead and just select all those faces. We can just select each of those loops. And then we'll just delete those. Do this real quick here. So this is one of the things that you find is that when modeling, although you try and watch out for all the different things that you're going to run into while texturing, it's often easy to forget about them. And so you find yourself going back in and then tweaking the model just a little bit when you come to texturing to make things work easier and smoother. Okay, now let's go ahead and let's just add a seam right down each of these. And that will allow them to just unwrap smoothly. And I'm going to hold an Alt, Shift, right click, and then Control E, mark seam, select everything, and U and unwrap again. And there we go. Now we have our entire model unwrapped. So at this point, we could just leave it and start painting our textures. But this isn't the case. I want to go in and show you a couple things to double check that our UVs are good. Number one, we need to make sure that we don't have any stretching, such that the image isn't being stretched across some faces. We need to make sure all the UVs are of equal scale so that our texture will be evenly spread across everything, and things like that. So, in the UV editor here, let's just hit N to bring up the Properties panel, and I'm just going to hit Shift Space first to maximize this. And let's go ahead and show, let's go ahead and click Image and New, and then we'll just name this, we'll call it Test, or UV Test. Okay, and I want to do is I'm going to leave it at 1024 by 1024. That's what we're going to be using today. I don't want to be painting on too big of textures. Since I am recording, it's a little harder to paint on large textures without slowing everything down. And also just because we need to make this fairly quick. So we're going to go ahead and check UV Test Grid, and this is a very handy feature that gives us this checkerboard pattern that allows us to very easily check if things are stretching. So now, if we go ahead and change the textured mode over to textured, which in 2.49, the shortcut key is Shift-T, and there's not a shortcut yet in 2.5, although you could very easily set one via the key map editor. And now looking at this, we can see that everything is pretty evenly spaced. We've got, look at just the checker squares, and most of them are mostly the same size. We've got some a little bigger here, some are bigger here, things like that. We zoom in, we can see maybe we've got some distortion in here. And so what you're looking for is very little distortion within the pattern. You should see mostly square forms. So now let's look at this again on the UV side. And one of the things I want to show you is, first off, the UVs are really kind of hard to see against the checkerboard pattern. And that's where it's nice to be able to change the UV display type, which against the checkerboard, I like to use white, just because it shows up real well. It's a little hard on the eyes, but you can still distinguish everything real well. Another thing I want to show is click on Stretch. And this is a lot like weight painting in that it shows you what's being stretched, what's not. So ideally, everything would be this solid dark blue. But as you can see, where things start to go to green, and then yellow, and then the worst is absolute red, where things are being stretched. And so you can see that most of this is pretty good. We're getting a little in here, which, oh wait, this seems that we have some extra faces in here, which are causing this to stretch. So let's go back, and we can see, oh, we forgot to get rid of some faces in here. And on here as well, which again, these are never going to be seen, so let's just get rid of them. So we'll hit X and delete faces. And if we unwrap again, we can now see that that stretching is a little bit less in there. Not great, but that's okay. We're going to go ahead and leave that for the time being, because again, the stretching there is not a big deal, because you're never going to see it. You see the little outline of the faces going down in the model, but you're never going to see that interior texture, and so for the sake of the tutorial, we're not going to worry about it. Next, the only other big area is this one here. We're seeing a lot of stretching around the perimeter of this end cap. And this is because we have a capped form that's trying to unwrap to a planar. So all of these edges are the furthest out. And so if we can fix this real quick by giving it some seams in which it can fold out. Think of it as a single paper form. If you were to try and fold a flat sheet of paper into this shape, you'd get a lot of creases here. You'd have to fold them in, or I believe what they're called are darts. You would have to create darts in it, or cut out triangular shapes in order to get it to form correctly. And so we can mimic that by going in, and we'll just add a seam at the four, rough corners. Okay, and one more. Control E, mark seam, and let's unwrap that again. And now you can see that it's much better. There's no very little stretching. As you can see, we've got these triangular forms that are then cut out that allow it to fold very nicely. So an easy way to think of the UVs is think of it as if you were creating a paper model. How would you form that shape from a flat piece of paper? Okay, so that's pretty much it. Although one last thing I want to look at before we get on to the actual texturing process is UVs and saving space. One thing with UV texturing in that it's very key to use your space as best as possible. Because if you think about this, this is a 1024 map that we're going to be painting on. Every single pixel counts. And so all of this area in here where there's nothing is just wasted pixels where there could be detail. And so it's best to try and save as much space as possible. And Blender has a tool that allows you to do this fairly well, and it's called Average Island Scales and Pack Islands. So first I like to hit Control A to average them, which will also help. It evenly distributes them such that they're all the same size in reference to the image. And also then hit Control P, and that will then pack the UVs into the space as best as Blender can. And this will serve for most people's purposes, although I like to do it by hand if I'm working on a complex model or if it's something that I really care about. And so at this point, you can go ahead and leave this as is, or it's best to also do some organization. So I like to go then and organize things such that they fit better. So number one, I like to say all these straps. Let's put them in one place. So number one, I'm going to rotate this around 180 degrees so that it fits with the rest of them. And then we'll grab this one as well. And so I just like to organize them so we've got all the lacings together, we've got all of the handle pieces together, things like that. And so we'll just go ahead and do this real quick. And so you can very easily select an entire island or set of UVs by just hitting L with your mouse cursor over it. And let's see, we can move the edges of the axe head down to the faces of the axe head, so that it's all right together, which makes it easier to find things in Photoshop. You don't want to have to constantly be switching back over to Blender to find what's what. I'll just rotate this a little just to kind of straighten it out. And then let's see, this is a metal end cap. This is the other metal end cap. We'll move those over. These are the two metal strips. We've got our handle here. Move that up. Our other two parts of the handle. Move those over. And you notice I'm not scaling anything because we've already got the scale set. Okay? And so then we'll move these in place. I also like to try and order it top to bottom. So in the case of all the metal here, I've got the bottom, middle, next middle, and top, just so I know really where everything is very easily. And then we'll go ahead and move the axe head up just a little bit. It's always best to try and keep things away from the edges just a few pixels, just to give yourself some playing room. Give yourself a little margin, as it's called. And the same thing, try to keep a few pixels space between each of your UV islands, just so you've got a little playing room again. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and leave that as is. So I'm going to save my model again. And at this point, let's go ahead and click on UVs and export UV face layout. And I'm going to put it in my textures folder underneath my axe. And we're just going to call this axe_UVs. And we can leave the rest default. And we're going to export UV layout. Okay, so now if we go in, and I'm just going to switch over to that folder. And you'll notice I have the axed UVs. Now, I forgot to append the file type to it. And so if we go ahead and just rename this, this should be a.tga. There we go. That way Photoshop will recognize it. And let's go ahead and just double click this to open it up in Photoshop. Oh, and I'm going to go ahead and resave this with the file name. Windows doesn't like to do this by default, so we'll just save that again. And now we'll just go into Photoshop, File, Open, Axe UVs. And interesting. Okay, real quick here, just to make sure things are overwriting. I may not have overwritten that actually. UVs, export UV face layout, and textures, axe_UVs.tga. The UV exporter always saves it as a TGA. Just keep that in mind. Now we can open that, and interesting. Okay. So I don't know why this is happening actually. It could be a error with Blender. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to save my file, and real quick I'm going to go ahead and open this up in Blender 2.49, which does have a good exporter that works. And and it says open 2.50 file. Key information like animation data will be lost. Continue. Yes, because I don't have any animation data. Everything else is fine. We'll go in, switch over to the UV editor, select everything. We can see it's all good. UVs, scripts, save UV face layout. And I want to save it as 1024. And we'll save all that. And you can actually save it as an SVG instead of a TGA through the script. But I don't want to worry about that, so I'm going to click OK. And we're going to save it in the textures folder, axuvs.tga, and save. And there we go. Now I can close 2.49, and we'll go back over to Photoshop, File, Open, and the script always appends the file, the object name to the name. So we'll just click Open, and there we go. So here we are in Photoshop with the UV layout, and now I'm gonna I just hit F a couple of times to change the layout. And now is where things start to get fun. So what I'm going to be doing, the way that we're going to be texturing this is through image-based textures. And basically we're just going to clone pieces of images into our each position, such as wood here, wood, metal, etc., to get the basic textures down, and then we'll go through and refine it. Now, some people like to paint their textures by hand, some people like to use image-based textures. It's both partially personal preference and also skill set. If you're a very good painter, then you can paint them by hand. More power to you. Personally, I am not a very good painter. I'm not very good at creating textures from scratch, except for on certain cases. And so I like to use a kind of a combination. And also, in this tutorial, we don't really have the time to paint all these by hand, and so I'm going to go ahead and use images. The key point is that I'm showing you the workflow on how to use it, and then you can go from scratch and do it any way you want to create whatever you need to. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and open up my series of textures, and I'm just going to be using a couple for this. Normally, if you were texturing something, you would want to use a large number of images so as to get a good variety and get lots of different sources. In this case, I have a single leather strap, a bare metal, and a wood, and then I also have a couple others that we may use, but we'll go ahead and leave them for the time being. So I'll just click Open. Now, each of these textures are from cgtextures.com, an excellent texture resource with royalty-free textures for free. I believe you're limited to downloading 5 megabytes a day, or you can sign up and get unlimited. Very, very good resource. I highly recommend it. It has a huge library of textures. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with the wood. And so with this image, I'm just going to select everything and hit Control-C to copy it. And hitting Control-Tab, I can switch back over to my UVs, at which point I'm just going to hit Control-V to paste it to a new layer. And at this point, what I want to do is I want to display my UVs on top so I can use it as a map. So first, double-click on the background and just click OK to change over to a regular layer. And then we want to just click and drag and move it up to the top of the layer stack. But the problem is that it's all white and we can't see anything below it. Well, luckily for us, we've got blending modes, which allow us to very easily change this. And so I want to change the blending mode over to multiply, which will make all white areas transparent, leaving me with just a black texture layout that shows me exactly where everything is, but it still allows me to see my texture very clearly. So now, clicking back over to the UV textures, first thing I want to do is hit Control-J to duplicate that entire layer to another layer, giving me a duplicate. And then I'm going to uncheck the visibility on the first layer to hide it so that I have a backup copy in the case that I deform anything. So now what I want to do is hit Control-T and right-click and rotate 90 degrees counterclockwise or clockwise, just to rotate it in line with the handle. And what I'm going to do now is using my cursor tool with V, I'm just going to move this around, and the scale feels, well, I can go ahead and scale it down. Now we'll go ahead and leave the scale as is. And we're just going to move this to a place where I like it. I want to try and avoid things like these wood putty filled holes, but I can clone those out here in a second. So I'm just going to go about like this, and then I'm going to go ahead and we'll go ahead and use our marquee tool with M, select this, and then hit Control-I to deselect it. or to select the inverse and hit delete to delete all extras, and then hitting Control D, I can deselect everything, V, move it over. Oh, and I guess it doesn't select or delete anything out of the bounds, but that's okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit Alt, right mouse, and drag, and to move this over. Oops. Actually, I want to hit Control J. I'm just going to move it to a new layer again. And then we'll move this over and grab another section about like this to fill in the rest of this area. And I'm going to move over to my eraser, scale up to a large size with a soft radius, and let's just delete all this. So what I've done now is given myself two portions of this image, which then erase it down the center, and I can get a pretty good representation of the wood. And we'll do the same thing, erase this side. There we go. Well, maybe. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and merge these down. And do keep in mind, I am not a texture artist of sorts, so I'm going to just basically show you the basics here, and then we'll go from there. Now what I want to do is go ahead and remove some of these areas. So I can use my clone tool with Shift-C, and we'll move this down. We've got a soft cursor. And I'm going to hold down Alt to sample an area, and I like this area here. We'll go ahead and just paste it over there. And same thing here. You want to be careful when using the clone tool so as to not blur things out, since when you layer it, it will tend to make things very fuzzy just because you're layering one thing over another. Okay, but that looks good. And now I'm going to go ahead and just very loosely with the lasso tool just select this perimeter. And then hit Control-Shift-I to invert my selection, and then click Delete, such that it's pasted strictly around that UV. Now, what I want to do now is go ahead and uncheck my visibility on this layer, and go ahead and, first off, save this image, and we're going to call it as the ax_color map. Click OK. And now let's go back over to Blender, and we want to load this up and render it so we can watch in Blender as we make progress. So first off, in the UV editor, let's go ahead and turn off the stretching. We don't need to see that. And then let's go ahead and image open, and under the ax textures, let's grab the ax color map and click open. Okay. And as you can see, it's loaded right up. If we then switch this over to textured view, we can see that mapped right in. Now, one thing that you will probably see, which actually I'm kind of surprised it doesn't show up all that well, is a seam right down the center here. Now, we're not going to worry about this for the time being. Hopefully we'll have time to get to how to remove seams, but we'll just see where we go. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And now we're going to continue on. Well, actually, first let me show you one thing. And just so we can see it as we're going, no, actually, I'm going to save this for later. What I was going to do is show you how to go ahead and apply this as a material, but we'll wait a little bit. Because what I'm going to do now is switch back over to Photoshop, and at this point, the entire process is the same on using these images to copy things over. So I'm going to go ahead and pause my recording to save some time, and paste in all these other areas to get them transferred over, just so we have our basic textures in. And do remember that we're not using just these. We're actually going to do a bunch more to go in, throw some more depth in, add contrast, things like that. But I'm going to go ahead and pause my recording just so that we're not watching the same thing that I just did here over and over again. So I will see you in a second. Okay, and I'm back. So you'll see that I've gone ahead and pasted in all the different portions of the axe. And right now, honestly, it really doesn't look very good. And that's where these next few steps come in. Before doing that, let's go ahead and save the file and check it out in Blender. When you update a file outside of Blender, you can simply go in and hit Alt-R to reload the model. Or I guess that doesn't work right now. It's probably not actually connected. But you can reload it from the menu, and you can then see everything in Blender. So, number one, you'll notice that it's very, very bland. You know, there's no good lighting, nothing like that. The textures aren't fantastic. You know, it's very mediocre, honestly. But before we go any further on the texture, let's go ahead and render it. So obviously our default settings are not going to be accurate for this. So I'm going to go ahead and select the camera, hit Alt-R and Alt-G. Move it over along the Y-axis. rotate it around, and then let's switch to camera view, and I'm going to go over to my scene buttons, and let's go ahead and change the resolution on the X to say, how about 800, and the Y will be 1200. Okay, and then let's move the camera down, move it out a little bit by hitting G and then middle click to move along the normal. And maybe we'll just move it out there and then rotate along the X-axis to see the whole thing. Pull it out a little bit more, and then we can go ahead and scale it all the way up and hit Control W. Now, I will warn you, in the last few weeks, I don't know if it's due to my video card on my end or if it's a bug in Blender, but I have had 2.5 crash a lot during render time. So if that happens, don't worry, I'm just going to be sure to save my file a lot, and then we'll go right back in. So just be aware that that may be a possibility. So, clicking render, oops, hit the wrong one, and there we go. As you can see, it crashed, so I'm going to pull that right back up. Oh, and one thing, actually, saw this in the comments, people asked if I could mention which build I'm using. As you can see on the splash screen, I'm using build 26168 for this. So we'll go ahead and reopen our model, and now let's hit render again. And we can see right now, obviously our lighting is completely off, so let's go ahead and put in some decent lighting. I'm going to grab my lamp here, we're going to change that to a spotlight, rotate it around, make sure it's lighting the model well. And we'll hit render again, and there we go. So I'm not sure what's going on, but it is crashing an awful lot while rendering, so hopefully this doesn't cause too many problems. And honestly, I think it's actually a problem with my video card, perhaps. I have been having some other issues with it, so unless this is being reported a lot, I would not worry about it too much. Okay, and you can see that's starting to look good. Still very basic lighting, but it's starting to work. Let's go ahead and add in, that's our main light, our key lamp. Let's go ahead and add in some fill lights, which we can do by duplicating this spot. We're going to turn off the specularity, turn off the shadow, and then turn the energy down to say, how about 0.3. We'll also give it a slight blue color, just to kind of help give it a cool aspect, and then duplicate that, rotate it around to the other side, and again, keeping the same. Then we'll go ahead and hit render, and there we are. So hold on. Really don't know what's going on with this, but that's all right. So I just need to redo that real quick, and then remember to save it. 1.3, rotate that around. Save it this time, and now we'll click render. And that's not too bad. Let's go ahead and put in some basic ambient occlusion. We'll use the approximate method. There we go. And now we'll save it again and click render. Okay, so now you can see we have our very, very basic model. I'm going to go ahead and change my render size down. Just put it at 50%. And there we go. Okay, bring it back up. Luckily for us, Blender loads very, very quickly. Now render this. Okay, so now you can see we have our very, very basic model with no textures. Let's go ahead and load in our textures by selecting the model and go over to the materials properties. Let's add a new material, and we'll just call this Axe D. And there we are. Let's go ahead and turn the specularity down just a little bit. And then we're going to go over to the textures, add a new texture, pull in an image, and we'll just click open. And we want to pull in our PSD. We'll click open and save it. And then we just need to change the image mapping over to or not the mapping, but the mapping here to UV. And then we can simply click render again. Slightly frustrating. Alright, come on. back. So, let's try and render this again. Okay, so now you can see that it's mapping, but it appears it's still not mapping to the UV, so map it back to the UVs, save it, and render. Alright, this is a little ridiculous, but it's okay. This is one of the things where you definitely want to be careful about working in 2.5. Be sure to save a lot, and whether it's something on your end or something on the development end, things are definitely still buggy, and so you want to be sure that you save your work often, and if you're working with anything that's very, very important, it's best to be safe and work strictly in 2.49 for the time being still. Okay, so now we can finally see it's rendered, and definitely looks a lot better now than in the viewport because we're seeing the ambient occlusion mixed in. And that's one of the things that we're going to do now, is I want to take that ambient occlusion and bake it out to our model so that we can actually use that to help influence our map. So what we're going to do is hit edit mode, go into edit mode, select everything, and we want to actually get rid of this image first, and then we're going to click new. And if we hit F6, then we can bring up the properties, say width, we'll call this ax_AO, and leave it at that. And now we're going to go over to the scene properties and go all the way down to the bottom and look at the bake panel. I'm going to choose the bake method as ambient occlusion, and we can leave it as that, and then just click bake. And now this may take just a little bit, but as you watch, you can see the ambient occlusion is showing up in the UVs. Oh, and actually moving that was probably not a good idea. We will go ahead and try that again. Bake. And so it's showing up underneath the UVs, as you can see. It's coming through. It can take a little while sometimes. There we go, and it's almost done. Once all these black areas are gone, you'll see it's complete, and this will also go away. Okay, so there we go. Now we can hide the UVs and check it out. Oops. Oh, and one unfortunate thing is that at times you can actually accidentally lose everything that was in the memory by changing things, so I've got to bake that one more time actually. Okay, so now we have our bake, and I want to go ahead and save this image out. So we'll save as, and we're going to call this ax_AO dot, let's do a PNG, because we can save the type, and PNG, and save as. Okay, and so now if we pull that image up, and hide those, yeah, there we go, and then we'll go ahead and move those over, and you can see everything that it's pulling in, all the basically shadow info that's being cast by the ambient occlusion, which will then pull into Photoshop here, pull in the AO, select everything with Control A and copy, and then go over and hit paste. And now what we're going to do is we're going to change this blending mode over to hard light, and there we go. You can see, oops, go back to hard light there. And now you can see that it's having an effect on all of this texture data, and it's not changing the color or anything like that, but it simply adds in all the shadow information and such. Another nice thing is it also crops out all of our extraneous texture data. So now we're going to go ahead and save our save our texture map again, and let's go back over, and we're going to set this back to the color map. So we'll go to Open, Color Map. I think while baking the color map, baking the AO, I managed to save over the color map somehow. And now we can go back over to our materials, and we can textures, and let's reload this image. Oh, and it switched over to the AO again. Color map. There we go. Save it in case we crash when we render. Render. And there we go. Crashed again. Okay, pull this back in. Okay, so now with loaded back up, we'll go ahead and render this again. And now you can see that things are starting to look much, much better, particularly with the ambient occlusion mixed in. So at this point, I want to do a couple things. We're not going to take the texturing much further at all, simply because we don't have the time. But you can see that this is definitely starting to build a foundation of where to go with it. But what I'd like to go ahead and do now is do just a couple more things over in Photoshop. Namely, I'd like to add some lightning along the blade so that we can see some definition there. And then I would also like to translate everything over to a very simple bump map, just to add a little extra pop to it. So what I'm going to do is let's bring up the layer that has the metal on it, which is this one here. And we're going to go ahead and just bring up the dodge tool, which is O, and scale it up to about the width of the blade. And with a soft edge, we're just going to go ahead and put in maybe a 20% exposure, and then just draw over that lightly. We'll do it, say, a couple of times, and if we turn off the wire, we can see it more accurately, which we're not getting much. Let's go ahead and turn this up to 50%. There we go. And we'll do the same thing on this side. And we just want to make that blade lighter since it's been sharpened as opposed to everything else. There we go. And you want to be sure not to overdo it. That should be about right. Maybe it's a little, let's maybe add in a little more dark around the edge to bring that up a little. So we'll bring in the burn tool and maybe just burn this a little in here and in here. There we go. Help just add a little more definition there. And we can go ahead and save this again, bring it back over to Blender, and we can reload that image. And pending no crash, hopefully, we'll go ahead and first save our file and then render. Hey, no crash. Okay, so there we go. That really helps just kind of bring out the blade. And now one thing that you will notice is that if we go in and look at this under textured view, we're going to have some seams, particularly in areas like this. Now, some of these areas, such as right next to the blade, that's actually okay, because there would be a seam there since this edge is being grinded and this one's not. But some of these seams like this, we don't really want, and things like that. So I'm not going to fix all of these, but what I'm going to do is real quick show you a method on how to get rid of these. And this is actually using the texture paint mode in Blender, and combined with the projection paint tools, which we can see if we bring up the toolbar with T. And what we want to do is we want to go ahead and grab the clone brush, using one of the presets here, and we want to go ahead and stencil it to use the UV textures. And then we want to, let's see, oh, the tool needs to be the clone tool. They don't actually have the brush presets set completely, but we want to use the clone brush. And we can scale the size up with F, maybe get the, blend will be good. And then we want to, let's see, I believe it's clone, use another UV layer to clone source, otherwise 3D cursor. We want to actually uncheck clone because we want to use the cursor as our clone point. This works like the clone brush in Photoshop, but rather than holding Alt and choosing a place to clone, instead we actually place the 3D cursor where we want it, and it clones anything under that cursor. And then we can paint over all of this. So first, let's go ahead and just go into edit mode. Since we can't place the cursor while in texture paint, hit tab to go into edit mode, and let's place the cursor right about here. And hit tab to go back out of edit mode, and unfortunately it doesn't toggle back to texture paint, so we'll just do that real quick manually. You could set up a custom key map to do that though. And then let's just click and draw. And you can see that it's painting directly what's underneath the cursor, and by painting over, and we want to maybe turn up the strength. You want to be careful not to do too light of a strength, or else it's going to, it's not going to blend well. We just paint that right over, and you want to be sure not to go too far, or you start to bring in the other elements. So we can just do this real lightly, and you can just paint right over all of those seams. And like I said, you need to be careful in the way that you do it. Like there, I may not have done it real well, or you're going to start to get just a very blurred texture. But we can, go in and do a little more work with it. And fix a little area there where I started to paint the wrong area. And one trick on this is to, rather than move the cursor, is move your object instead. Oops. Because you can move it along the cursor real easily. And then whenever you're done, simply hit Alt-G to reset the location of that object. And so I'm not going to do this too much more. I'm probably just going to mess it up. But you can see how you can go in and fix all those seams pretty easily. Much easier than trying to manually do it in Photoshop. There we are. And, you know, like I said, you need to be careful not to overdo it for sure, or it starts to look pretty cruddy pretty quick. But you can definitely be real careful about it and do it. A couple other areas where you may see the seams are right here along the leather straps. So we can fix that real easily. Same thing. Notice that I'm moving the object, not the cursor. Okay, so you know, and then we can do it. We can do it down here. There we go. And so you would continue doing all of that to paint it. And then if you wanted to then take this a little further to do some cleanup work or something like that, to fix some of the areas where maybe you blurred it out, you can then just switch over to the UV image editor and pull up that image and save it. So we'll go ahead and just save that. And Blender does not actually be able to save PSD files, so it saved it as a JPEG, which you could then replace in Photoshop if you needed to do more work, you name it, you know, whatever you needed to do. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and undo, or we'll just leave that as is. But I'm going to go ahead and, yeah, just leave that. So now if we bring this back over to the texture, we can reload that. You notice that it automatically updated this, which is handy. And so the last step that I want to do is go back over to Photoshop, and I want to select all this, or actually we're going to save this. And then since we made the changes in Blender, I'm going to now go ahead and open up that JPEG, which is right, it's this one. And now I'm going to add a new layer, and a little trick here to first do this is to fill this layer with a 50% gray by hitting Shift-Delete, 50% gray, and click OK, and then change that blending mode over to saturation. And what we're doing is creating a basic bump map. And so a bump map is nothing more than the grayscale values from white to black, that the lighter the value, the more raised it is, the darker the value, the more lowered it is once you apply the bump map. And so using a grayscale value, we can create a very basic bump map that will work for the most part. You know, we definitely want to go in and do a little more work with it to make it act right. And if you were doing this for a professional object, you would want to actually go in and probably paint a lot of the bump map by hand, adjust layers and whatnot. But some of the things that we can do to adjust this, because one thing you will notice is that a lot of, like, the axe head is a lot lighter for the basic value. Same here. The leather straps are a lot darker. Well, a lot of these areas ought to be pretty much the same. And so even though I'm not going to go in and do this exact, what I'm going to do real quick is pull up my lasso tool, and then just real quick, say here on the straps, let's just draw across these real quick, trying to avoid the axe head. And I grab this area, go in and add some of this to the selection, remove areas right here around the axe. I'm just holding down Alt and Shift to do that. Same thing here. Okay, so now with that selected, then I can go into Image and Image Adjust, and let's do the levels, and just try and get a much lighter or a more even tone to these in comparison to everything else around them. Oh, and I need to cancel. doing it on the wrong layer. You need to do it on the background layer. Adjustments, levels. We can go in, lighten this up a little bit. Good thing with bump maps is to add a good bit of contrast, just so that there's a definite difference. That'll do it. Pull that in a little bit more, and then close that and hit Control D. Let's go ahead and hit Control L to bring up the levels for everything, and we'll just add a little more contrast to these. Pull out some of the gray areas. And I'm no expert at bump maps or on creating them, but we're going to go ahead and just leave this as is, just for the sake of time. Obviously, you would want to do a lot more with this if you were creating a polished piece, but so for the time being, let's go ahead and save this. I'm going to hit Control-Shift-S, save it as a PSD, and we'll call this axe_bump map. Click OK, OK. Go back over to Blender, and we're going to add in a second texture channel. So we'll click here, click New, change this over to an image, and open, textures, and we want axe_bump map.psd, open, and then we want to change the mapping once more to UV, and then under the influence we want to turn off the color, which you can't really see here. Here we go, I'll scale these down so you can see it. We want to turn off color and then turn on normal under geometry for that, and then we're going to save it, and my guess is that this is going to crash right here, but we'll see, and it did. Now we're back again, and we're going to try rendering this again. Gotta love crashing. And we're rendering this, and we'll see how this looks, and it didn't want to render. There we go. Okay, so now you're not going to see a whole lot here, partially because we have a very low specularity on this. So let's go ahead on the material. Let's raise the specularity a little bit, because that's how it detects a lot of the bump areas, or that's how it's faked, is by the specularity. So rendering this, see there, and you're starting to see a little bit more detail in there being raised by the bump map, particularly in areas like this. We can enhance this a little bit by using the bump map also as a specular map. Now, I do not encourage you to do this, because you ought to actually create a specular map along with the bump map, which is a map that's strictly black and white, that tells Blender which areas to receive more specular highlights than others. So you could go in and on the edge of the axe, paint it solid white. On the edges of these, paint them white, things like that. In fact, let's actually just do that real quick. This is going to be very, very quick and easy. So what we're going to do is save this. I'm going to go ahead and open the... Oh, that is not what I wanted to do. We're going to open the UVs again. And then on this layer, I'm going to add a new layer. Change the background. Move that up. Change it to multiply once more. And then we're going to fill this with a solid black by hitting Control, let's see. Oh, there we go. Hitting Control D to fill it with the background color. And then we actually need to invert. Nope, that won't work. If we invert the image and switch over to screen, there we go. So I just inverted it with Control I and switched it to screen to make the black areas transparent and the white pull out. And now let's just go in and with a soft, a soft white brush. So D to bring up the default colors, switch X to switch to the white, and bring this in. And I'm going to switch over to my tablet just real quick just to get a little more accurate. And we want to go in here, and on the edge of the axe, we're just going to paint in with a solid white. Make it a little softer, or a little harder. Not that hard. And this is just going to be very, very basic. It's not going to be accurate at all. I just want to show you how this works. So do keep in mind this is not accurate at all, but you'll see how this works. So now we're going to hide this, and we're just going to save this as a very, very basic We'll call it just axe underscore spec. Okay, and we're actually probably not going to use this, but I want to show you how it works. So add another texture, click new, image, and open. And we want to grab the spec, click open. Then under the mapping, again, it's going to be UV. And the influence this time is going to be color. Oh, we're going to deselect color, and then under specularity, adjust the intensity, 1% or 100%. We'll save it and render. And so there you can see that it's now it's bringing out the specular highlights in the areas that we drew. So you can see along the edge of the axe, along here, and so that's the way that works. Is it pulls in the specular highlights based on the white areas. So it works real well to kind of fine-tune your texture, and is really one of the essential things to creating a good solid texture. I'm going to go ahead and just disable it for the time being, because that is not one that I would ever display on a model. But, so that's basically the process. We've got a color map, a bump map, and then a quote-unquote spec map that we're not actually going to be using for the time being. But one of the things that you can actually do if you're in a rush, and only if you're in a rush really, is use the bump map as a basic specular map as well, and just click specular, and then maybe take the intensity down a little bit just so it's not too strong, and we'll hit save and then render. And so there you go. You can see that the bump map is also pulling in some of that detail, and one of the things that it does also for when used as a spec map is that it kind of brings out some of the extra detail and things like the wood and whatnot, as you can see down here. So if you're in a rush, you can do it. I don't encourage it, but I've done it myself multiple times. It's one of the things to save time if you need to. But if you're going to do that, one of the things you might do is go in and really adjust the contrast and balance to make areas pop a little more than others. So there we go. That's that. At this point, what you would do would be to go in and remove rest of these seams, add more detail to the texture, maybe add in some scratches and worn areas to the handle, scratches and such to the metal. This is a quote-unquote battle axe after all. So, those are a bunch of things that you could continue doing with this. And in fact, if you happen to be a citizen member, or if you buy the source files to this, I would love to see where you take the texture from here. I'm going to go ahead and leave this where it is for the time being, simply for time constraints. I would love to take it a lot further, but I don't think you want to sit and watch a 2-hour tutorial just on creating these simple textures. So we're going to go ahead and save the file there, and I will leave you there for the night. I hope you've enjoyed this, and once again, thanks again for watching.